Elaine stood in the middle of her living room, surrounded by decades of memories, boxes filled with forgotten trinkets, closets stuffed with clothes she hadn't worn in years, drawers overflowing with papers she no longer needed. She wasn't a hoarder, not by any means, but somehow, her home had become a museum of the past, and the thought of sorting through it all? Overwhelming. Then she heard about Swedish death cleaning, a decluttering method not about death, but about living lighter, freer, and with intention. Today we're diving into 15 simple ways to start, beginning with a mindset shift that changes everything. 1. It's not about death, it's about living well. Elaine hesitated the first time she heard the phrase Swedish death cleaning. It sounded morbid, unsettling, like preparing for the end. But when she looked deeper, she realized it was the opposite. It wasn't about death at all. It was about life, living with less stress, less clutter, and more freedom. She thought about her friend Marjorie, who had spent months sorting through her late mother's belongings. The process had been exhausting, emotionally draining, and worst of all, filled with uncertainty. Marjorie had no idea what her mother would have wanted to keep, donate, or toss. That's when it clicked. Swedish death cleaning isn't about getting rid of things before you die. It's about making life easier for yourself and your loved ones right now. It's about choosing to keep what truly matters and letting go of what doesn't, so no one else has to make those decisions for you. And the best part, there's no rush. Swedish death cleaning is a gentle, ongoing process, one that gives you time to reflect, reminisce, and make thoughtful choices about what stays and what goes. Elaine took a deep breath. This wasn't about loss. It was about creating space for herself, for her future, for the things that truly brought her joy. And so she began. But first, she needed a starting point, something small, something manageable. 2. Start with the easy stuff. Elaine knew she couldn't start by sorting through old letters or family heirlooms. That was too emotional, too big of a leap. Instead, she took the advice of Swedish death cleaning experts and began with the things that held no sentimental value. So, she walked into her kitchen and opened the infamous junk drawer. There it was, half-used birthday candles, expired coupons, takeout menus from restaurants that had closed years ago. She chuckled, wondering how she had managed to accumulate so much nonsense. It was an easy win. She tossed what was expired, reorganized the useful items, and felt lighter already. From there, she moved to the bathroom. Half-empty bottles of lotion, expired medications, and makeup she hadn't touched in a decade. It all went, and not once did she feel sad about letting any of it go. By starting with the easy stuff, Elaine built momentum. There was no guilt, no hesitation, just a growing sense of control over her space. And by the time she reached the harder categories, she had already strengthened her letting go muscle. 3. Would anyone want this? Elaine stood in front of her closet, staring at a row of dresses she hadn't worn in years. Some were too small, some were outdated, and some, well, she kept them simply because she always had. But then she asked herself one simple question. Would anyone want this? If the answer was no, because it was worn out, damaged, or just not useful, it was an easy decision. It went into the donation or discard pile. But if the answer was yes, if it was still in good shape and could bring joy to someone else, then she made a plan for it. She donated to a local women's shelter, gifted a few pieces to a friend's granddaughter who loved vintage fashion, and even repurposed some fabrics for craft projects. Suddenly, letting go didn't feel like losing something. It felt like giving something. And here's the thing. Most of what we hold on to isn't valuable. It's just familiar. But when we shift our thinking from keeping to sharing, decluttering becomes an act of kindness. Elaine smiled as she packed up the last bag. This wasn't about emptying her home. It was about passing things forward, making room for what truly mattered. And just like that, she was ready to move on to the next phase, letting go of things that held not just space but memories. 4. Clothing. Keeping only what you love to wear. Elaine stood in front of her closet, running her fingers over fabric she hadn't worn in years. She had dresses from weddings long past, jackets that hadn't seen daylight in a decade, and shoes she had convinced herself she might need someday. But the truth was, she only wore the same handful of outfits over and over. She thought back to her friend Lydia, who had downsized her wardrobe last year. "I got rid of everything that didn't make me feel fantastic," Lydia had said. "Now getting dressed is easy, and I never feel guilty looking at things I don't wear." Elaine wanted that simplicity. She created a rule. If she didn't love wearing it, it had to go. One by one, she held up each piece. Did it fit well? Did it make her feel confident? If the answer was no, it went into the donation pile. If it was too worn out, it was repurposed as cleaning cloths or discarded. And you know what? She didn't miss a single thing she let go. Her closet became a space of ease, not stress. Every piece she kept had a purpose. No more rummaging, no more guilt, just clothes she enjoyed wearing. 5. Papers and documents. Sorting what truly matters. Elaine had avoided this task for years. Every drawer, every cabinet, even old purses, seemed to be filled with papers. Receipts, warranties, bank statements, medical records, greeting cards, notes she'd scribbled down on scraps of paper, but never looked at again. The thought of sorting through it all felt overwhelming. But then she remembered something her son had told her, after clearing out her late husband's desk. "Mom, most of this didn't need to be saved. I just kept what mattered." She shredded what was outdated, digitized the essentials, and stored everything she actually needed in a labeled file. In less than 2 hours, she had cleared out years of accumulated paper clutter, and just like that, she gave herself and her family the gift of never having to sort through mountains of unnecessary paperwork again. 6. Books and magazines. Keeping stories that still speak to you. Elaine loved books. They were a part of her identity, a source of knowledge, comfort, and nostalgia. But when she looked at her shelves, she had to admit she wasn't reading most of them. Some had been gifts she never truly wanted. Others were reference books she hadn't opened in years. And then there were the stacks of magazines she had saved for later. Except later never came. She sat down and thought, which of these books do I still want to spend time with? She pulled out her favorites, books she knew she'd reread, books that brought her joy just by sitting on the shelf. Everything else? It was time to pass them on. She donated novels to the library, passed cookbooks to her daughter, and gave children's books to her neighbor's grandkids. The magazines? She flipped through them one last time, kept a few recipes she wanted, and recycled the rest. What remained were shelves filled only with books that truly mattered to her. No clutter, no guilt, just the stories she still wanted to tell. And as she ran her hands over the now organized shelves, she felt something unexpected: relief. Elaine was beginning to see it clearly. Swedish Death Cleaning wasn't about loss. It was about choosing what still had meaning, and she was finally ready to face the next challenge. The sentimental things, the ones tied to memories, emotions, and the past she wasn't sure she was ready to let go of. 7. Family heirlooms. Deciding what stays in the family. Elaine sat on the floor, surrounded by items passed down through generations. China sets, embroidered linens, an old brooch from her grandmother, and a collection of letters dating back to the early 1900s. Each piece carried a story. Some she cherished deeply, while others, if she was honest, had simply gathered dust for decades. She thought back to when her mother had passed, and she and her siblings were left to sift through boxes of keepsakes. They didn't know what was important and what wasn't. Arguments arose over who should take what, and some items ended up in storage, forgotten and neglected. Elaine didn't want to leave that burden behind, so she called her children and grandchildren, inviting them over for tea. As they sat around the table, she laid out some of the most sentimental pieces and asked, "Would you like to have any of these one day?" She was surprised by the responses. Some items she had assumed would be treasured were met with polite declines, while unexpected pieces, like a simple wooden jewelry box, sparked nostalgia and eager claims. That day Elaine made a decision. She would only keep heirlooms that truly mattered to someone. Anything else could be donated, repurposed, or let go. She wrote small notes about the origins of certain pieces, and set aside those with real meaning. And as she placed the rest into donation boxes, she felt lighter. Her legacy wasn't in objects, it was in the love and memories she shared. 8. Photos and letters. Digitizing, sharing, and keeping the best. The box had been sitting in Elaine's closet for years, filled with old letters, black and white photographs, and postcards from places she barely remembered. She had always planned to sort through them, but each time she opened the lid, the sheer volume made her close it right back up. But this time, she was ready. She set up a cozy spot in the living room, brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea, and started flipping through the past. Some photos brought back warm, familiar feelings. Others, she realized, had no real meaning to her anymore. There were multiple shots of the same event, stacks of blurry images, and letters that, while once important, no longer held the same weight. She decided to digitize her favorites, scanning them into a simple folder on her computer so they could be shared with her children and grandchildren. She even made a small scrapbook with just the most meaningful pieces. By the time she was done, she had reduced decades of clutter into a carefully curated collection of the best moments of her life. And for the first time in years, those memories weren't hidden in a box. They were visible, celebrated, and ready to be shared. 9. Gifts and past treasures. Releasing guilt around letting go. Elaine pulled out an old ceramic vase from the top shelf of her cabinet. It had been a gift from her dear friend Nancy years ago, given with love and good intentions. But here's the thing. Elaine had never actually liked it. She had kept it out of guilt, feeling that getting rid of it would somehow dishonor their friendship. That same guilt had kept her holding on to countless other items. Scarves she never wore, books she never read, trinkets from vacations she barely remembered. But then she thought back to something her granddaughter had once said: "A gift is meant to bring happiness, not obligation." That changed everything. Elaine realized that holding on to something out of guilt wasn't honoring the giver, it was just cluttering her life. If a gift had served its purpose by bringing a moment of joy, then it had already fulfilled its role. It was okay to let go. She packed up the vase and other unwanted gifts and donated them, knowing they could bring someone else real joy. And just like that, she freed herself from the invisible weight of obligation. No more keeping things because she felt she should. Now she only kept what truly made her happy. As she looked around her home, she saw less clutter, less guilt, and more space for the things that truly mattered. She was beginning to see it now. This wasn't just about tidying up, this was about reclaiming her life, piece by piece. 10. Kitchen and household items. Only keeping what you use. Elaine opened her kitchen cabinets and sighed. Stacks of mismatched plates, mugs from vacations she barely remembered, gadgets that promised to make life easier, but had only collected dust. When had she accumulated so much? She reached for a bread maker she hadn't used in years. It had been a well-meaning gift, but honestly, she preferred store-bought bread. The juicer she swore she'd use daily, it had been untouched for months. And why did she still have 3 sets of measuring cups? Then she remembered her mother's kitchen, always cluttered, always overstuffed. After her passing, Elaine had spent weeks sorting through it all, trying to guess what was important and what was just taking up space. She didn't want that for herself, and she certainly didn't want it for her family. So, she grabbed a box and started asking herself, "Do I actually use this?" If the answer was yes, it stayed. If the answer was no, she set it aside for donation. No guilt, no second guessing, just practicality. By the time she was done, her kitchen felt lighter, cooking was easier, cleaning was faster, and opening a cabinet no longer felt like digging through a time capsule. She realized something important: a home should serve the life you have now, not the one you had years ago. And now, her kitchen reflected that. 11. Hobbies and collections. Choosing what still brings you joy. Elaine had always been a collector. Stamps, figurines, old postcards, tiny treasures she had picked up throughout her life. Each item had once meant something, but now they sat in boxes, gathering dust. She knew she needed to face them, but part of her hesitated. What if she let go of something and regretted it? Then she thought about her friend Doris. Doris had spent decades knitting, but arthritis had made it difficult in recent years. Instead of letting her yarn and needles sit unused, she had donated them to a local craft group, passing her passion forward. That idea stayed with Elaine. She kept a few sentimental pieces, the ones that still sparked joy when she held them, but the rest, she donated them to local collectors and thrift shops, and even gifted some to her grandchildren. As she packed up the last box, she didn't feel lost, she felt relief. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing what mattered now. And as she looked around, she saw a home that reflected who she was today, not just who she had been in the past. 12. Digital decluttering. Organizing a lifetime of photos, emails, and files. Elaine thought she had tackled most of her clutter, until she sat down at her computer. Thousands of emails, forgotten downloads, and digital photos that stretched back for years. She had saved everything: receipts for online purchases, newsletters she never read, blurry photos that should have been deleted ages ago. Her digital space felt just as cluttered as her home, so she set a timer for 30 minutes and started with the low-hanging fruit: emails. She unsubscribed from newsletters she never read, deleted old messages, and created folders for the important ones. Then she tackled her photos. She kept the ones that made her smile, deleted duplicates, and backed up the meaningful ones to a cloud service, so her family could access them anytime. By the end of the week, her digital life felt as streamlined and peaceful as her home. She had once feared that decluttering meant losing something, but now she realized it was never about loss, it was about freedom. 13. The emotional benefits of decluttering. Elaine hadn't expected this. She thought Swedish Death Cleaning was about tidying up, making space, and organizing for the future. But as she sat in her now lighter, calmer home, she realized something else. She felt different inside, too. For years, she had carried things that no longer served her, not just objects, but guilt, obligation, and even memories that weren't always kind. Every box she opened had brought up emotions, some joyful, some painful, some she hadn't fully processed. And with each item she let go of, she wasn't just clearing space, she was clearing emotional weight. She remembered the day she had finally sorted through her late husband's belongings. It had taken years for her to feel ready. And when she did, she wasn't just going through his things. She was permitting herself to move forward, while still holding on to the love. That was the real beauty of this process. Decluttering wasn't about forgetting, it was about honoring what mattered most. And now, sitting in her peaceful, uncluttered home, she felt a kind of lightness she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about making things easier for her family someday. It was about giving herself the freedom to enjoy life fully, right now. 14. Leaving a thoughtful legacy. Elaine had always assumed her legacy would be in the big things: the will, the finances, maybe a few treasured heirlooms. But as she had sorted through her belongings, she realized something profound. The things she left behind should tell a story, not create a burden. She thought back to her friend Joan, who had passed away last year. Joan had been a wonderful woman, but when she was gone, her children had spent months sorting through her things: boxes of paperwork, closets packed with clothes, drawers stuffed with things no one knew what to do with. Joan had never meant for her family to go through that stress. But because she had never made those decisions for herself, they had been left to guess. Elaine didn't want that. So she wrote notes on the things that mattered: her grandmother's wedding ring, the painting she had bought on her honeymoon, the small wooden jewelry box her daughter had always loved. She made sure the important documents were in order and easy to find. And most importantly, she let go of everything else that no longer told her story. She realized that her real legacy wasn't in things. It was in the memories, the moments, and the love she had shared. And now, when the time came, her family wouldn't be left with a heavy burden. They would be left with clarity, gratitude, and a home that reflected the best parts of her life. 15. Maintaining a clutter-free life. Moving forward, Elaine had done it. She had decluttered her home, her digital life, and even her emotional baggage. But as she sat in her peaceful, organized space, she knew one thing for sure. Clutter had a way of creeping back in. She had spent a lifetime accumulating, and if she wasn't careful, she could spend the next few years doing it all over again. So, she made a decision. Swedish death cleaning wouldn't just be a one-time purge, it would be a way of life. Every few months, she would take a moment to assess her belongings. Had she accumulated anything new that she didn't need? Were there things she had kept that no longer felt important? Instead of waiting until the clutter built up again, she would handle it as she went. She also made a new rule. Before bringing anything new into her home, she would ask, "Do I truly need this?" If the answer wasn't an enthusiastic yes, she left it behind. Most importantly, she didn't let guilt dictate what she kept. Gifts, outdated clothes, impulse purchases, they didn't have to stay just because they had once entered her life. And so she moved forward, not weighed down by the past, but fully present in the now. Because Swedish death cleaning wasn't really about cleaning at all. It was about choosing a life of ease, simplicity, and joy. Look at you, decluttering like a pro. Elaine's house isn't just lighter, her mind is too. Less junk, more joy. That's the real magic of Swedish death cleaning. So tell me, what's the first thing you're kicking out of your house? Drop it in the comments. I'll bring the virtual high fives.